I heard my mother say inside the interrogation room, I never knew how to love her. She stole my husband's love, so I had to remove her. Yes, she destroyed her own daughter, locked me in a mental hospital when I was just 18, all because she was jealous of my father's love for me. She thought I'd disappear forever, but she was wrong. I came back not for love, but for revenge. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now and get ready for our series of betrayal, revenge, and justice. I was 17 the last time I saw Bennett Estate bathed in sunlight. Funny how your memory can betray you. I used to think of that place as grand, timeless, a monument to legacy. But now, when I picture it all I see are the shadows. My name is Isla Bennett, or at least that's what they called me before they erased me. The Bennett name means something in Massachusetts. Old money, old power, and older secrets. I was the firstborn, the rightful heir to a fortune built on shipping banking and decades of carefully polished reputation. But I learned early in the Bennett family being born first doesn't mean being chosen. That role belonged to my sister Charlotte. Charlotte, the darling, the golden child. Even now, I can still picture her long blonde hair catching the light like some Renaissance painting, her laughter echoing down the marble corridors, while I stood just outside the frame. She was the portrait they hung in public. I was the flaw they hid behind locked doors. And then there was my mother, Catherine Bennett. I used to think she was beautiful. The kind of beauty that made men hesitate, that demanded silence when she entered a room. But beauty doesn't last, not when you've seen the cruelty beneath it. I was 18 the day she had me committed. No tears, no hesitation, just her voice cold and surgical slicing through my last illusion of safety. She's not well, Catherine told the doctors. She's unstable. She's a danger to herself. I remember standing in the grand foyer of Bennett Estate, my suitcase in hand, thinking it was some misunderstanding. I kept looking at her, waiting for the lie to end, but it never did. Her final words before they dragged me away, "You were never meant for this family." I didn't scream. Not then. Screaming was pointless in a house that rewarded silence. The facility wasn't far, just 30 miles outside the city. Close enough for convenience, far enough to be forgotten. 2 years. 2 years behind walls that smelled like bleach and fear. 2 years of white pills and forced therapy sessions where they told me my memories were hallucinations. And then, silence. No visitors, no letters, no family. Until one rainy Thursday they told me I was stable. They let me out. Not because I was better, because they'd taken everything from me that mattered. But the thing about ghosts, we learn how to haunt. I became someone new after that. I changed my name. I changed everything. Law school in New York, internships in London, and finally Paris. Elise Gray, not Isla Bennett, not the girl from the estate, just Elise Gray. And yet here I am. Sitting in this office sunlight filtering through glass too clean to be real files stacked neatly around me, wearing a name that doesn't belong to the girl they tried to bury. And I'm holding an invitation. No, not an invitation. A challenge. My mother, Catherine Bennett, the Ice Queen herself, is turning 60, and to celebrate she's throwing a party. A grand affair at the family estate. 80,000 square feet of polished floors and empty promises. A ballroom of people who never once asked what happened to me. It'll be the event of the season, they say. Bennett Estate. Home. I trace the embossed lettering on the envelope, feeling its weight in my hands. My name isn't even on it. It's addressed to the eldest Bennett daughter. As if they couldn't remember me, only my place in the lineage. A cold laugh escapes me. They never thought I'd see this. They never thought I'd come back. But that's the thing about the past. You can only lock it away for so long. I glance at the mirror across the office. The woman looking back at me is nothing like the girl who left that estate. Her eyes are sharper. Her smile doesn't reach her eyes anymore. I am no longer Isla Bennett, but I remember her, and she remembers everything. The world thinks Catherine Bennett's legacy is untouchable. In 3 days, at that grand celebration of 60 years of power and perfection, I'm going to remind her of the one thing she failed to erase. Me. 3 days. That's all the time I had before the world saw my mother sip champagne beneath the chandeliers of Bennett Estate, her guests clapping politely, oblivious to the blood buried beneath her marble floors. 3 days to dismantle the woman who once dismantled me. I wasn't Isla Bennett anymore. Not here. Not now. The woman checking into the Winslow Hotel that morning had no past. Her name, legally carefully crafted, was Elise Gray. No connection to the Bennetts, no digital footprint linking her to that family's skeletons. Just another professional woman from Paris booking a quiet executive suite 2 miles from Bennett Estate. I watched the receptionist slide the keycard across the polished counter, her eyes flickering across my passport, her expression unreadable. I'd learned how to wear that same mask. Polite, blank, forgettable. Exactly what I needed to be. By noon, I was standing in the parking lot of the Essex County Courthouse, staring up at the brutalist gray building that had once sealed my fate. The same building where 15 years ago, a judge declared me mentally unfit. I walked through the glass doors. The air inside tasted sterile sharp with the scent of old documents and newer lies. 15 years ago, I walked in here as Isla Bennett. Today, I was Elise Gray. And this time, I wasn't the victim. At the records department, the clerk barely looked up when I handed over the forged court order. Weeks of preparation, weeks of careful planning, and it worked. The document looked authentic enough request for access to archived probate and medical documentation pertaining to one Isla Bennett. Court-ordered review. Routine. She handed me a clipboard. Sign here. My fingers shook. Not from fear. From rage. I signed. 10 minutes later, I was sitting at a metal table in a small windowless room under flickering fluorescent lights. The file was dropped in front of me. Yellowed. Thick. I stared at the name stamped across the top. Bennett Isla Marianne. The clerk left. I opened the file. At first, it felt like cutting open an old wound. Pages of reports labeling me unstable, delusional. Phrases circled in red ink: paranoid ideation, borderline psychotic episode, recommend long-term institutional care. I recognized none of it, because none of it was real. I flipped faster, my hands trembling. Then I found it. The 2 documents I'd come for. The psychiatric evaluation official notarized, and the revised last will and testament of Jonathan Bennett, my father. Both signed, both witnessed, both notarized. By the same man. My stomach lurched. Dr. Robert Hayes. I whispered the name out loud, the syllables foreign and venomous. The same man who certified me unfit to inherit. And the same man who witnessed the will transferring my father's estate to my mother and Charlotte. Legally, that's impossible. Ethically, it's catastrophic. In the world of power and wealth, it's called fraud. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the broken ceiling light. I remembered Robert Hayes. I remembered him standing outside my hospital room, whispering to my mother. I remembered the way he avoided looking me in the eye. And now here he was, the notary of my father's death and the architect of my own erasure. It wasn't paranoia. It was premeditated. I closed the file slowly, every movement deliberate. I knew what my mother had done. But now I could prove it. When the clerk returned, I smiled politely. Finished already, she asked. I nodded. My smile didn't reach my eyes. Quite finished. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. I stood on the courthouse steps, letting the winter wind cut through my skin until my mind cleared. Every family has secrets, but mine had always preferred to bury them alive. Now for the first time, I held the shovel. I pulled out my phone. Searched. Found him. Dr. Robert Hayes. Still practicing. Still living comfortably just 2 towns over. Still profiting from the life he helped destroy. I looked at his address. Then slowly I smiled. The next move belonged to me. The bar hadn't changed. That surprised me. After all these years, I half expected it to vanish like the rest of my childhood. But there it was, tucked between a pawn shop and a boarded-up bakery, the Green Lantern. Cheap neon flickering weakly in the window. Smelled like old whiskey and forgotten promises. It was perfect. I pushed open the door. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of stale beer and something more familiar: resignation. The kind of place where people went to forget they once mattered. And there he was, Robert Hayes. He sat slouched at the far end of the bar, nursing something brown and strong. Time hadn't been kind to him. His once expensive suits had given way to wrinkled blazers, his hair thin-skinned, bloated. But his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were still there. Just dulled now like a knife left too long in the rain. I slid onto the stool beside him. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. That was the plan. Scotch, I said to the bartender low enough that Robert heard. Neat. It only took a few moments. He glanced sideways, brief, appraising. Rough night, I asked. He snorted more to himself than to me. Rough decade. I let that hang in the air. Silence works wonders on guilty men. The bartender delivered my drink. I let it sit, untouched fingers tracing the rim. You used to work at St. Augustine's, didn't you? I asked softly, as if dredging up some half-forgotten memory. That got him. He tensed. Not much, but enough. I did. Psychiatric facility right east of the city. Long time ago. Hard to forget a place like that. He didn't answer. I kept my voice casual, almost nostalgic. My cousin was there, years ago. Said the doctors were all ghosts. His jaw tightened. We did what needed to be done. I sipped my drink then, finally, letting him believe I was just making conversation. Letting him believe the past was something he could outrun. Ever hear the name Bennett? That did it. He froze. I turned, met his eyes. He saw me then. Not Elise Gray. Not Isla Bennett. But the consequence of his choice. He stood abruptly, knocking his glass over. Liquid pooled between us. I don't know you. He tried to move past me. I caught his wrist. Not hard. Just enough. Sit down, doctor. My voice didn't shake. He sat. Because men like him, they know when the ghost finally steps out of the mirror, it's too late to run. You signed papers, I said softly. 2 of them, on the same day. His breathing was ragged now. You lied, for her. Leave it alone. She paid you. He said nothing. So I leaned in. Say it. His hand shook as he reached for the bottle instead of the glass, pouring himself another without looking at me. 200,000, he whispered finally. Cash. Offshore. I let that confession settle, let the weight of it fill the cracks in my bones. $200,000. That's what my life had been worth to him. I slid my phone closer along the bar screen, black recording all of it. He kept talking. I didn't know what she'd do to you. She said you were unstable, dangerous. She said she was protecting the family. I almost laughed then. Protecting. What a beautiful lie. What she did, I whispered, was erase me. His knuckles whitened around the glass. I needed the money. We all need something. I finished my scotch in one long burning swallow. The weight of the recording in my pocket felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. I stood. Robert Hayes looked up at me, a ruined man in a ruined bar. What are you going to do? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm going to remind her that I was never gone. I left him there, drowning in liquor, drowning in guilt. And this time I didn't look back, because some ghosts don't haunt. They hunt. St. Augustine's hadn't changed. At first glance, it almost looked abandoned. Ivy strangled the stone walls, windows dulled with years of dust. But the gates still locked from the inside. Places like this don't die. They wait. I stood outside for a long time, letting the cold creep under my skin, letting the memories I'd buried drag themselves back up from wherever I'd shoved them. Then I pushed the gate open. Inside it smelled the same. Bleach, antiseptic, fear. I walked past the rusted wheelchair near the entrance, down the long corridor where the lights still flickered overhead just like they did 15 years ago. My footsteps echoed against the cracked tile, loud in a place where silence used to suffocate me. The walls whispered. Isla Bennett. Not Elise Gray. Not here. I reached Ward C. The door was half ajar. I stepped inside. The room was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just gotten bigger, stronger, harder to cage. Pale blue walls. A metal bed bolted to the floor. Thin mattress. No pillow. I ran my hand over the chipped paint of the windowsill where I used to scratch my fingernails, raw carving lines I hoped someone would see. No one ever did. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let the past come. The needles. The white pills that made the world spin, that slowed my mind until I couldn't remember my own name. The restraint straps still attached to the bedposts. The voice of the nurse who never once looked me in the eye. Just relax, Isla. I had forgotten how much it hurt to remember. And yet, I let it in. I needed to. Pain is like oxygen here. You either learn to breathe it or you drown. I stood, paced. Every inch of this room had once been my world. The ceiling vent where I used to whisper to myself, convinced someone could hear me through the pipes. The cracked floor tile near the door where I hid paper clips I stole, thinking maybe someday I could pick the lock. The corner where I sat, knees to my chest, too numb to cry, too scared to sleep. I crossed the room, knelt beside that cracked tile. Out of habit, and that's when I saw it. Buried half beneath the dust. A bracelet. I reached for it slowly like it might burn. Thin leather, brittle from years of cold. But the engraving was still there. Isla B. I ran my thumb over the letters. Over the identity I once thought they'd stolen. They didn't. They only buried her. I slid the bracelet onto my wrist. It didn't fit anymore. I wasn't that girl. Not anymore. I looked around the room one last time. Every scar on these walls was mine. And for the first time in years, I wasn't ashamed. I stood in the center of the cell and whispered to the shadows that used to terrify me. You should have killed me when you had the chance. My voice didn't shake. I walked out. I didn't look back. Because the past isn't meant to be escaped. It's meant to be claimed. I left St. Augustine's with the bracelet tight around my wrist. A reminder, not of what they did to me, but of what I survived. And as I stepped into the sunlight, I knew. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I was going to burn their world down. Brick by brick. Lie by lie. Starting with the house that still bore my name. Bennett Estate. Money. In the Bennett family, love was optional. Money wasn't. Power wasn't. So that's where I started. After St. Augustine's, after the bracelet, after I walked away from my own grave, I knew exactly where to strike next. Not their hearts. They didn't have any. Their accounts. The hacker didn't ask for details. He didn't care about old money scandals or family betrayal. He cared about payment discretion and results. I wired the deposit before he even said yes. His name was Grant. Or maybe it wasn't. Skinny early 30s, lived in hoodies and basement apartments. But his mind surgical. Precise. "You're sure this is what you want?" he asked, flipping through encrypted files like they were recipe cards. "I'm sure," he shrugged, cracking his knuckles. "Then let's bury your mother." I watched from across the table as he tunneled through firewalls that were supposed to be unbreakable. Catherine Bennett's world was locked tighter than most. Offshore accounts, dummy corporations, charitable foundations acting as polished fronts for darker ledgers. But nothing is perfect. Not even her. After hours of silence, punctuated only by the tap of Grant's keys, he leaned back, blinking against the glow of his screens. "There it is?" I leaned in. At first it looked like numbers. Just that. Numbers. Strings of transactions meaningless to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But I did. The Bennett Family Trust. The Bennett Legacy Foundation. The Catherine Bennett Children's Health Initiative. All of them. All registered as charitable organizations, tax-exempt, untouchable. Except they weren't. Because from each one over the last 12 years, money flowed outward. Not to hospitals, not to education, not to the scholarships my mother loved to advertise at her charity galas, but to a single account, held under an alias. In the Cayman Islands, beneficiary CB Holdings. I stared at the screen. Millions. Tens of millions. Stolen. From the very children she claimed to save. "Tell me you can prove it," I whispered. Grant nodded. "I can map the transfers. Timestamp them. Link every dollar." He paused, then looked at me. "But Isla, you expose this, she's finished." "That's the point." "No." His voice lowered. "I mean finished. Not embarrassed. Not just shamed in some article. I'm talking federal charges. Fraud. Money laundering. Wire fraud. This level of financial crime, it's prison." I sat there, silent, because in that moment I understood. What I was about to do wasn't just revenge. It was destruction. I breathed in. "I don't care." For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then Grant clicked a final command, and the data burned onto an encrypted drive. "You'll need this." He slid the drive across the table. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I looked past him. Past the screens. Past the flickering walls of code. To the storm I was about to unleash. This wasn't about stolen money. Not really. It was about stolen lives. Mine. And every child my mother pretended to help while bleeding their futures dry. I picked up the drive. It felt heavier than it should have. "Thank you," I said. Grant shrugged again, but his eyes were wary now. "Just remember, once this goes public, there's no putting the monster back in the box." I left without another word. Back in my hotel room, I stared out the window at Bennett Estate, its silhouette carved against the horizon like a monument to everything I once feared. 3 days until the party. 3 days until the guests would gather. 3 days until the chandeliers glittered and champagne flowed. And in 3 days, Catherine Bennett's empire would crack from the inside. I reached into my bag, clutched the bracelet still hidden there. "You built this house on stolen money," I whispered. "Now you can watch it burn." My plan was simple, brutal, and public. At the height of the party, when the press, the donors, the politicians, the society parasites were all watching, I'd expose her. Not behind closed doors, not in courtrooms where money could still buy silence, but in front of the cameras, where reputation dies the fastest. Her legacy was built on illusion. I'd make her watch it collapse, piece by piece, just like she did to me. Bennett Estate never looked so perfect. The marble had been polished to a mirror's sheen. Every chandelier caught the light like diamonds. Strings of violins played something elegant, soulless. Caterers moved like clockwork. And the guests, their laughter too loud, their smiles too white, filed in, eager to witness 60 years of Catherine Bennett. She stood at the grand staircase exactly where I expected her. Regal, untouchable. A silk gown the color of blood sculpted her frame, diamonds heavy on her throat, hair swept back severe as her reputation. Charlotte hovered close at her side, her mirror, her shadow. Blonde perfection in a designer dress greeting Boston's elite like royalty. Every step they took, every practiced smile was a lie. But tonight the lies would splinter. I stood at the gates, breathing. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass doors. Elise Gray. Not Isla Bennett. Not yet. I stepped forward. Inside, the warmth swallowed me whole. Perfume, champagne, the hum of conversation. No one noticed me. Just another guest. Another body lost in the glitter. Exactly what I needed. I let them celebrate. I watched my mother raise her glass lips, parting for rehearsed gratitude eyes, scanning the room like a queen surveying her kingdom, until she saw me. It was subtle. First a hesitation, then her gaze snagged on mine. Recognition. And with it, fear. Her glass faltered just enough for a single drop of champagne to spill onto her wrist. Charlotte said something. Catherine didn't respond. She was frozen. I let her drown in it. I moved slowly, deliberately through the crowd. Silk whispered against marble. Guests turned slightly as I passed, faint curiosity blooming, then fading when they didn't recognize me. But my mother, she saw. She felt. Because ghosts don't vanish. They wait. Until you remember them. I stopped at the edge of the staircase. She descended. One step, then another. I could hear her breathing now. Tight. Controlled. Desperate. Isla, she breathed. No one else heard. Just me? I tilted my head. Said nothing. Her voice cracked next. Elise Gray. I smiled. And her world tilted. Because she realized. She realized that the daughter she buried wasn't dead. She'd been watching. Waiting. And tonight, she came home. Not for forgiveness. Not for mercy. But for reckoning. She moved fast for someone wearing 4-inch heels. One hand clenched around my wrist nails, biting into my skin. The other pressed against my back, pushing me forward away from the music, the guests, the cameras, into the darkened corridor behind the ballroom. The smell of roses and perfume faded. What replaced it was sharper. Panic. She dragged me into my father's old study. A room that once meant safety. Now it felt like a mausoleum. The door slammed shut behind us. Take that dress off and get out of my house. Her voice. It wasn't a command. It was a threat. I said nothing. She circled me, breathing shallow, her movements coiled. Every inch of the Ice Queen now cracking, splintering, but still too proud to shatter. You've humiliated yourself enough for one night, Isla. I smiled softly. I'm not Isla. A pause. Something shifted behind her eyes. Elise Gray, I whispered. The woman you forgot to bury. Her face twitched. I reached into my pocket and pressed play. The silence broke. Robert Hayes's voice filled the room, low and hoarse. 200,000. Cash. Offshore. She paid me to sign the papers. Catherine went still. I watched her throat constrict, watched the lie calcify behind her lips. She said the girl was dangerous. She said she needed to protect the family. Hayes's confession echoed off the walls like a funeral bell. I let it play. I let her drown in it. Her lips parted. You recorded him. I nodded. And then, her voice changed. Cold, controlled, calculated. How much? My smile didn't reach my eyes. You think I'm here to be bought? That's what this is, isn't it? Her mask slid back into place. Tell me your price, Isla. Elise. I stepped closer. Try to remember? Her expression cracked again. Deeper this time. I don't want your money, I said. I want your truth. Her control faltered. You won't survive exposing me. Then let's find out. I pressed stop. Silence bled into the room. She shook her head slowly, like she could undo the past by sheer will. You were weak, Isla. You were always weak. You never understood what it means to protect a legacy. You never understood what it means to protect a daughter. Her breath hitched. For a second. For less. But I saw it. The human beneath the monster. And I knew it terrified her. I should have killed you when I had the chance, she whispered. I leaned forward. You did. I'm what came back. I stepped past her. Hand on the door. 3 days from now when they see you fall, remember this moment. Why her voice cracked behind me? Because this is the last time you had a choice. I didn't look back. And neither did the ghost of Isla Bennett. The ballroom was a masterpiece of performance. Crystal chandeliers glittered, waiters moved like shadows, glasses clinked politely under the hum of practiced conversations. Catherine stood near the grand piano, the queen of her empire, her smile a weapon no one dared question. Charlotte hovered close, her hand light on their mother's arm, perfect as porcelain. And then the music stopped, not with ceremony, with fracture. The screen above the main staircase flickered to life. At first, the guests thought it was part of the presentation. Catherine's curated slideshow, the legacy reel. But it wasn't. Static, then sound, a voice. Robert Hayes. 200,000. Cash. Offshore. She paid me to sign the papers. Silence hit the ballroom like an earthquake. The crowd froze. Catherine's breath was the first thing to break. No. The word fell from her lips without thought. But the voice continued. She said the girl was dangerous. She said she needed to protect the family. Gasps spread like wildfire. Cameras rose. Phones lifted. Journalists invited here to chronicle a legacy now filmed a collapse. Catherine turned to Charlotte, her voice shredded. Turn it off! Turn it off! But the techs weren't moving. Because someone had locked the system. I stepped forward. From the shadows. From the silence. From the grave they'd buried me in. I crossed the marble floor slowly, the hem of my black dress whispering over the stone as Robert Hayes confessed again and again over the speakers. The name they'd tried to erase echoed through the air. Isla Bennett. When Catherine collapsed to her knees, Charlotte caught her just before she hit the floor. I kept walking. I stepped into the center of the room. Every eye turned, phone still filming, and I spoke. They locked me in a place where my name didn't matter, where my memories were dismissed, where every scream was met with silence. I raised my head. And they did it for this. I gestured around us. The chandeliers, the legacy, the illusion. Catherine's breathing shattered behind me, but I didn't look back. I am Isla Bennett, the daughter they erased, the sister they betrayed, and tonight you see the price of their perfection. No one spoke, because truth is louder than confession. It doesn't need to ask for attention. It takes it. They built their empire by turning me into a ghost. Tonight, I haunt them. Cameras clicked, and Catherine, once the Queen of Bennett estate, was nothing more than a woman on the floor clutching her daughter's arm, gasping for a past that no longer existed. I turned slowly, letting every face see me, letting every camera capture the girl they'd been told never existed. I am not their secret anymore. And then I walked, away from them, away from the ashes, because ghosts don't linger in broken houses. They burn them down. Scandal spreads faster than truth. By the time I reached the edge of the estate grounds, the headlines had already begun. Bennett family legacy shattered. Heiress exposes psychiatric fraud scandal. Catherine Bennett accused of corruption and abuse. It was everywhere. The photographs, too, of Catherine half collapsed beside the piano, her face white beneath the diamonds. Of Charlotte, eyes swollen, makeup streaked, clinging to a woman who once ruled her world. Of me, standing in the center of it all. Not broken, not invisible, just seen. For the first time, I walked further, past the hedge maze, past the marble fountains I used to trace with my fingertips as a child. My footsteps were slow, measured, not because I was savoring the moment, because I knew the cost of it. Behind me, the guests were leaving. The perfect party Catherine had planned for 6 months, the one meant to crown her 60 years, was now a crime scene of whispered betrayal and camera flashes. Police cars, ambulances, security guards guiding people out the doors, reporters swarming. And Catherine Bennett, the woman who once defined my nightmares, was being carried out by 2 security men, her face hidden behind trembling hands. Charlotte followed behind her, shoulders shaking. She wasn't holding her mother's arm anymore. She was holding her mother's weight. And for that, I didn't feel triumph. I felt nothing, because betrayal doesn't taste like victory. It tastes like ash. I kept walking. Let them drown behind me. Let them answer questions. Let the world decide what to do with the story I'd handed them. I didn't care. My war was over. I'd burned down the house that built me. Now I wanted silence. I crossed the gravel drive, the stones crackling beneath my heels, and reached the edge of the tree line where no cameras could follow. I stopped once, just once, glanced back at Bennett Estate. Not for nostalgia, not for regret, but because ghosts deserve to watch the house burn. Then I turned, and kept walking into the dark, and I didn't look back again. Morning came not with sunlight, but headlines. Bennett scandal, charity, fraud, psychiatric abuse, criminal investigation launched. I watched the news from the corner of a cafe window, a black coffee untouched between my hands. My face was everywhere now. The girl they buried, the heir they erased. Only I wasn't the heir yet. Not legally, not yet. Outside, the street felt quieter than it should have. But that was the trick of trauma. Everything looked normal while your world ended. The television behind the counter showed live footage from the Bennett Estate. Police cars lined the gates. Crime scene tape wrapped around marble like a warning. Frozen assets. Catherine Bennett's accounts, her legacy, her empire frozen. And Robert Hayes, arrested. Caught stumbling from his house hours before dawn, handcuffed in his bathrobe as reporters swarmed. The charge: falsification of legal documents, accessory to inheritance fraud, pending conspiracy charges. I wanted to feel satisfaction, but all I felt was clarity. This was only the start. I left the cafe before the story moved to something else, because I had somewhere more important to be. At precisely 9:00 a.m., I stood inside the office of Preston Locke, estate law attorney, feared and respected from Boston to D.C. He didn't ask why I was there. His eyes said he already knew. I handed him the file. Every stolen document, every financial trail Grant had uncovered, every legal scar my mother thought she'd hidden. He flicked through the papers without expression. Then he looked up. Are you ready for this? I was born for this. Very well. He picked up the phone. I need a formal petition filed with Essex County Court. Immediate injunction on the Bennett estate inheritance. Motion for full investigative audit. Grounds: suspected fraud, false psychiatric certification, and misappropriation of charitable funds. He paused. Add wrongful removal of legal heir. My stomach tightened. Hearing those words said aloud made them real. I nodded once. He hung up. It's done. Just like that. Years of silence. Years of being invisible. And now the law would have to see me. I stared at the framed degrees on his wall. Harvard Law, Yale, Oxford. None of those names mattered more to me than the one I was about to reclaim. Tell me what happens next, I said. Preston leaned back, his expression flat but steady. We take everything back. I let the silence stretch. Let it fill my lungs. Let it become my armor. They took everything from me once, I said softly. They don't get a second chance. He met my eyes. No, they don't. Behind us, the city moved forward, unaware that somewhere between justice and revenge, I had just declared war. Not with anger, but with paperwork. And this time, they couldn't lock me away. This time, I was the one holding the key. She found me where I knew she would. At the ruins. Not literal ones, the old greenhouse behind Bennett Estate. Abandoned. Forgotten. A place where things once grew until no one cared enough to keep them alive. I stood there watching sunlight fracture through cracked glass. Her voice hit me first. You destroyed everything. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Her footsteps crunched closer, heels scraping against broken stone. I said you destroyed everything. Then her hand gripped my arm. I looked at her. Charlotte. My sister. Perfect Charlotte. Only now not so perfect. Her hair was tangled. Her eyes rimmed red. Last night's makeup smeared along her cheekbones like ash. And in that moment I saw it. She wasn't my rival. She was my collateral damage. What do you want from me? I asked softly. Her voice cracked. I want to know why. You already know. I don't. Her hand dropped from my arm. She stepped back, shaking her head like she could unsee me. You took Mother's life apart. You humiliated me. In front of everyone. I turned fully now. I didn't destroy the Bennetts, Charlotte. I just turned on the lights. Her breathing hitched. I thought you were dead. I was. Her face crumpled. And suddenly she wasn't angry. She was 17 again. Terrified. I knew she whispered. I knew Mother lied. I knew she sent you away. I heard her. I heard her tell Dr. Hayes what to write. I didn't move. I couldn't. And I did nothing. She sank down onto the cracked stone bench, shoulders shaking. I was afraid. I thought, if I said something, she'd send me away too. You chose survival. Charlotte buried her face in her hands. I chose silence. And that was the truth. Not a weapon. Not a betrayal. Just the truth. For years I'd believed she was my enemy. But sitting there sobbing beneath the glass bones of the greenhouse, I saw it. She wasn't the villain. She was the child too scared to pick a side. And I had been the price of her fear. I crouched down in front of her. Her mascara-streaked hands lowered. Her eyes met mine. You're right, I said softly. She flinched. You did choose silence. She nodded miserably. And that silence killed me. Her tears fell harder. But I caught her gaze. That ends now. She stared at me like a woman waiting for her sentence. But I wasn't here to condemn her. I stood. I'm not the one you need to ask for forgiveness. She shook her head, choking. She'll never give it. Then stop asking. Charlotte looked lost. I don't know how to be anything else. I looked down at her. And for the first time in a very long time, I saw my sister. Not my replacement. Not my jailer. Just a broken girl who'd never learned how to choose herself. I let the silence linger. Let it settle between us. Then softly, neither did I. I walked away. And this time she didn't follow. Not because she hated me, but because some ghosts aren't meant to be chased. They're meant to be understood, and maybe someday forgiven. The walls of the interrogation room were sterile. Fluorescent light metallic table. 2 cameras tracking every word, every silence. Catherine Bennett sat across from the prosecutor, wrists trembling just above the tabletop, her diamond necklace long since confiscated, her empire reduced to the bruises beneath her eyes. She didn't look like a queen now. She looked small, but poison doesn't need a throne. You authorized these transfers, Mrs. Bennett. The prosecutor's tone was clinical. Not cruel, just inevitable. Millions rerouted from charitable foundations to personal accounts. I protected my family, Catherine said flatly, by defrauding the law. She flinched. By now she knew numbers don't lie. People do. But this wasn't about the money. Not entirely. The prosecutor shifted the file toward her. Let's talk about the psychiatric committal of your daughter. Silence. Not the composed kind. The suffocating kind. You bribed a physician to declare her unstable. Why? Catherine's knuckles whitened. I won't answer that. You will, under oath. She shook her head, but her voice cracked. She wasn't supposed to exist. The prosecutor frowned. I'm sorry. Isla. Catherine's throat convulsed. She ruined everything. Behind the two-way mirror, Isla stood motionless, hearing every word, watching every breath. I did what had to be done, Catherine whispered. Explain that. She was always in the way. Her tone wasn't anger. It was venom disguised as regret. My husband, he loved her too much. The prosecutor sat back. Too much. He looked at her the way he used to look at me. Catherine's lips trembled, and I hated her for it. The silence that followed wasn't procedural. It was grief. Warped, weaponized. She took him from me, before he even died. Tears slipped down Catherine's face then, the first anyone had seen. But they weren't for Isla. They were for herself. I couldn't compete. Mrs. Bennett. I sent her away because every time he said her name I felt invisible. Behind the mirror, Isla's breathing fractured. I erased her, Catherine whispered. Because she erased me. In the observation room, Isla's knees buckled slightly. She pressed her palms against the glass. But her mother couldn't see her. Not now. Not here. And maybe not ever. The prosecutor's voice softened. You understand this isn't just a family matter anymore. Catherine nodded weakly. I know. What do you feel toward your daughter now? Catherine hesitated. Her voice when it came wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was empty. I don't know how to love something I spent my life hating. Behind the glass, Isla's tears fell silently. She didn't look away. She let herself shatter. Because some truths aren't meant to heal. They're meant to hurt. And sometimes knowing the reason is worse than never knowing at all. The verdict wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Deliberate. Expected. Catherine Bennett guilty. Fraud. Falsification of legal documents. Conspiracy to commit psychiatric abuse. The sentence 12 years. I watched her face as the words landed. She didn't flinch. Not once. Maybe she'd known long before the judge said it. Maybe the part of her that cared had already withered months ago or years. Or maybe her silence was the final way she could still control the narrative. If she couldn't win, she could at least refuse to bleed publicly. When the gavel dropped, I didn't move. Neither did she. The courtroom emptied. Journalists poured outside their cameras and headlines waiting to dissect the fall of an empire. But inside, it was just two women, a mother, a daughter, and a silence too vast to fill. She never looked at me, and I didn't offer forgiveness she didn't want. The bailiff led her away. I stayed seated and watched the door close. Charlotte was next, but her story ended differently. The court didn't sentence her. She sentenced herself. At the final civil hearing, she stood in front of the judge, palms trembling, voice breaking. I'll take responsibility for my share of the estate. Civil liability, financial restitution. When the judge asked why, her answer was small, fragile. Because she shouldn't carry this alone. Her voice cracked on the word she, and in that moment I knew. She meant me. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. The media wanted me to claim victory. Reporters asked whether I'd reclaim the Bennett estate, the empire that should have been mine all along. I told them no. I didn't want the house. I didn't want the title. I didn't want the empire built on silence. And when the estate finally went up for auction, marble halls, chandeliers, ghost-filled corridors, and all, I let them believe I'd walked away. But sometimes revenge isn't a courtroom verdict. It's quieter. After the estate sold, the public records showed the buyer Gray Holdings, a meaningless shell company, at least to everyone else. To me, it was my new name, Elise Gray, the daughter they disowned, the woman they forgot, the ghost who bought the house no one thought she wanted. I signed the paperwork alone, in silence. No cameras, no press, no family, just me and a deed. I owned Bennett Estate, but not as Isla Bennett, as someone freer, someone who would decide what came next. I stood in the grand foyer days later, listening to the echoes of a childhood I didn't want, and whispered to the walls that once trapped me, this house belongs to survivors now, and I meant it. The house didn't look the same, not anymore. The marble floors remained, the chandelier still hung heavy over the foyer, but the coldness was gone. The mirrors, once used to reflect perfection, had been taken down. The portraits that glared down from the walls, removed, replaced. Haven House opened quietly. No press releases. No charity galas. Just a door. And the women who stepped through it. They came alone at first, each one carrying the same thing, silence. Betrayed wives, daughters, mothers, girls with eyes too old for their faces. They didn't trust anyone. Not yet. But that's what healing sounds like. Silence before the voice. I watched them as they arrived one by one. Their eyes darted like prey, like mine once did. They stood in the foyer where I'd once been told I didn't belong, shrinking beneath ceilings too high, too grand, waiting for the next betrayal. And I met every single one of them, at the door, not as Isla Bennett, but as Elise Gray. Not the woman who owned this place, but the woman who survived it. Some couldn't meet my gaze. Others looked too long. It didn't matter, because I said the same words to all of them. Come inside. No more marble-tipped cruelty. No more locked doors. No more mothers who whispered you were never enough. Inside rooms once built to intimidate had been stripped down. Soft chairs. Warm lighting. Real silence, not the suffocating kind, but the kind that lets you breathe. At night, some of them cried. I heard it. I remembered the sound. And every morning I opened the doors again. One night, standing in what used to be my father's study, I watched the newest arrival. A girl, maybe 20, bruised, silent. She wouldn't speak. Not yet. I sat beside her, hands still. Not touching. Not pushing. Just there. Hours passed. Then, without looking at me, she whispered, "Why did they do it?" I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. I answered her like I was answering myself. Because breaking you made them feel stronger. She trembled. I reached out gently this time. Not to save her. just to let her know someone was still there. They lied to you. Her breath caught. But survival, I said softly. That's the truth they can't erase. She looked at me then, for the first time, and in her eyes I saw something impossible. Hope. Later in the common room, I wrote a phrase on the blackboard. No therapy slogans, no charity platitudes, just truth. Sống sót là cách trả thù đẹp nhất. Survival is the most beautiful revenge. And for the first time I believed it. The letter arrived on a morning heavy with rain. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting the moment I saw it. Charlotte. The envelope smelled faintly of her perfume. That soft, expensive scent Mother taught us both to wear. A scent that now felt foreign against my skin. I sat alone in my study once my father's now stripped bare of his memory and opened the letter with careful fingers. No apology began with Dear Isla. Charlotte knew that. Instead, the first words bled onto the page like regret. I should have protected you. The ink ran slightly in places. Whether from the pen or her tears, I didn't know. She confessed everything. The nights she heard Mother's instructions. The mornings she passed my empty bedroom pretending not to notice. The years of silence. She admitted knowing I wasn't sick. And she admitted why she stayed silent. I wanted to be loved, and I thought if I told the truth I'd lose her. Her handwriting broke then like her voice might have if she'd spoken it. She said she was sorry, and for the first time I believed her. She asked for nothing. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Only understanding. When I finished reading, the letter trembled slightly between my fingers. Not from anger, but from something quieter. Sadness. I stood across the room to the fireplace and fed the letter into the flames. The paper blackened, curled, vanished. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you. And in that moment, I chose to be free. Not for Charlotte. Not for Catherine. But for me? A week later, I stood in front of a courthouse clerk. No photographers, no audience. Just a form and a choice. Name change approved. I watched as the judge stamped the final page. Congratulations, Ms. Gray. It sounded strange, but it felt right. I walked out of the courthouse beneath gray skies, the rain soft against my skin. The name Bennett no longer belonged to me. And for the first time in my life, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. The gardens were blooming again. Not the manicured perfection my mother once demanded. Not the silent order of Catherine Bennett's legacy. But real. Messy. Alive. I walked slowly across the courtyard of Haven House, once Bennett estate now reclaimed not by wealth, but by survivors. Women kneeled in the dirt where marble statues used to stand, their hands caked in soil, their voices light with laughter. Roses climbed old iron fences, lavender spilled into the paths. Sunlight poured through the broken glass of the old greenhouse, no longer abandoned, but thriving. They were planting new roots, and so was I. Their stories weren't mine. I didn't ask for details, but their eyes told enough. Some had fled marriages that promised protection, but delivered bruises. Some carried the quiet scars of mothers who didn't know how to love without conditions. All of them carried one thing: the weight of being betrayed by those who should have sheltered them. I watched as one woman, barely more than a girl, pressed a seedling into the earth dirt, clinging to the inside of her wrist where bruises once bloomed. She looked up, smiled at me, and for the first time in years I smiled back. I kept walking, past the arches where I'd once hidden, past the steps where I used to trace childhood shadows. This wasn't a prison anymore. It wasn't even a house. It was a beginning, a home. I stopped at the center of the courtyard, turned slowly, faced the camera, faced them, faced you. My voice didn't tremble when I spoke. They locked me in my past, called me weak, unstable, disposable. I let the words settle, not bitter, not angry, just true. But today, I build the future with the same hands they tried to silence. I paused. Let that truth belong to me. Then I looked out across the women planting their first gardens, their first chances, their first freedoms. They thought betrayal would break me. A beat. They were wrong. Fade out. The screen darkened, but my voice remained. If someone ever tries to erase you, soft, strong, direct. Become what they fear most. A pause. Become the truth. Silence. Then the final words etched slowly across the black. If someone tried to erase you, be their reckoning. Cut to black. End of story. End of silence. Beginning of everything.